What if everything you thought you knew about Princess Diana's family was a carefully crafted lie? For decades, the world has been told the same story. Diana Spencer, the shy kindergarten teacher, was a commoner who stepped into a fairy tale when she married Prince Charles. She was framed as the girl who lived next door, ordinary, relatable, plucked from obscurity, and transformed into a global icon. That was the myth, and it was repeated so often that most people accepted it without question. But behind the headlines and the palace photographs lies another story, one written not in romance or glittering gowns, but in blood, betrayal, and a legacy the monarchy would rather you forget. The truth is that Diana's blood was never common. It was royal, older, darker, and more dangerous than the Windsor dynasty she married into. Hers was the hidden inheritance of a family line the crown itself tried to erase as the Tudors. We think of the Tudors as long gone, their dynasty ending with Elizabeth I in 1603, their palaces now relics, their blood spilled on the scaffold or swallowed by the soil. History books tell us the line died, extinguished by time and political betrayal. But bloodlines are harder to kill than kings imagine. The Tudors did not disappear. They simply fell silent, passed down through daughters, hidden in marriages, concealed in family trees, waiting for centuries. And in the 20th century, when the world least expected it, their legacy returned in the form of a young woman the press called the People's Princess. Princess Diana was not just the girl from the Spencer estate. She was the living descendant of Mary Tudor, Henry V's younger sister, the woman who dared to marry for love against the will of a king. That defiance cost Mary everything: her title, her status, her freedom to shape her children's futures. Yet her blood survived, quietly carried through generations, flowing eventually into the Spencer line. Diana's ancestry was not the fairy tale of a girl raised from common roots to royal splendor. It was a centuries-old struggle of women silenced, punished, and erased, only to reappear in Diana, a woman who, centuries later, would defy the monarchy in her own way. Think about the irony. The House of Windsor believed it was bringing in an outsider, someone who could soften their image, someone who would play the part of the obedient royal bride. But instead, they invited into their dynasty the very bloodline their ancestors had once feared, the line they thought had been crushed. Diana, with her warmth, her refusal to be silenced, her connection to ordinary people, embodied the same spirit that had once threatened to unravel Henry V's careful succession plans. The parallel is chilling. The Tudors were notorious for their bloody politics. Siblings turning against each other, daughters imprisoned by queens, cousins executed for daring to wear a crown. Their story is one of ambition and punishment, of brilliance suffocated under tyranny, and Diana's life, centuries later, unfolded with a strangely familiar rhythm. A woman adored by the people, but trapped within a royal system that could not control her. A woman betrayed. A woman whose light shone too brightly to be dimmed, and whose death left the world in mourning. The fairy tale was a mask. The reality was a cycle of history repeating itself. But here is the most haunting part. This wasn't just about Diana. Her children, William and Harry, carry the same blood. And when William takes the throne, the dynasty Henry V tried so hard to silence will, at last, sit again on the English crown. The ghost of the Tudors is not buried. It is alive, waiting to rule. This is not the story you read in textbooks or hear in official documentaries. It is the hidden lineage, the buried truth. Diana was more than the people's princess. She was the Tudors' revenge, the living echo of a dynasty history claimed had ended. And to understand how this came to be, we cannot begin with Diana. We cannot even begin with the Spencers. We must go back 5 centuries, to a palace cloaked in whispers, to a young woman named Mary Tudor, a princess who defied her brother, the most dangerous king in English history. She was not supposed to change the course of bloodlines, but she did. Her decision would set into motion a chain of events that echoed across generations: imprisonments, executions, scandals, and secrets, until finally it resurfaced in Diana Frances Spencer. So before Diana walked down the aisle in her ivory silk gown, before the world wept at the sight of flowers piled at Kensington Palace, before she became a global icon, her story was already written in the pages of Tudor history. And it begins not with a coronation, not with a parade, but with a forbidden marriage that nearly cost a king his throne. Because to understand Diana's true legacy, we must go back to the beginning, back to the day a princess dared to choose love over power, and in doing so, changed history forever. Mary Tudor was born into brilliance, a daughter of Henry VI, sister to the future Henry V, a princess raised not in freedom, but in expectation. From the moment she could walk, her life was measured in alliances, treaties, and dories. They called her the Pearl of England, a girl of dazzling beauty with auburn hair and a spirit that shone brighter than the jeweled halls she walked through. But behind the compliments was a truth every royal daughter knew: she belonged not to herself, but to the crown. At just 18, Mary's fate was sealed. Her brother Henry, then only in his 20s and eager to display his power across Europe, arranged her marriage to the aging King Louis VI of France. Louis was over 50, frail, and desperate for an heir. Mary was young, radiant, and fertile, the perfect bargaining chip. She did not love him. She did not even know him. But for Henry V, her heart was irrelevant. England needed influence, and Mary would provide it. The wedding in 1514 was a spectacle of gold and silk, yet beneath the grandeur lingered unease. Imagine her riding into France, the streets lined with strangers shouting foreign words, her smile forced, her hands trembling inside jeweled gloves. For Mary it was not a triumph, it was exile. The court whispered about the girl too young for her husband, about the king's failing health, about how long she would last in this strange country. She was a Tudor, but in France, she was alone. And then, less than 3 months later, Louis II was dead. His reign with Mary had lasted 82 days. Suddenly, she was the Dowager Queen of France, a widow before her 19th birthday. Some might have seen it as liberation, but for Mary, it was terror. She knew the rules of her world. A young, beautiful widow was a political weapon. She could be remarried at any moment, traded again to secure another alliance. But Mary carried a secret. Before she had left England, she had begged her brother Henry for one promise. If she were widowed, she could choose her next husband. Henry had nodded, but he was a king first and a brother second. Promises in politics were as fragile as parchment in fire. Mary's heart already belonged to someone: Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. He was not a king, not even of royal blood. He was Henry's closest friend, a man of charm and ambition, a knight who had caught Mary's eye long before France had claimed her. Their affection had grown in stolen glances, in whispered conversations, in the dangerous intimacy of a princess and a courtier who should never have dared to dream. When Louis died, Henry sent Brandon to escort his sister home. But with that mission came a warning sharper than any sword: bring her back untouched. Everyone at court knew what disobedience meant. Henry V was not a man of patience. To cross him was to invite ruin, or worse. Yet when Charles Brandon arrived in France, the distance between them dissolved. Mary was desperate. She had tasted what it meant to be married off like cattle. She would not endure it again. She told Charles plainly, if he did not marry her, Henry would force her into another cold political union, and she would rather die than obey. What choice did he have? In secret, under the vaulted ceilings of a French chapel, Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon pledged themselves to each other. It was a marriage sealed in defiance, not diplomacy. No witnesses from the English court, no approval from her brother, no pomp of royal decree. Just love, fragile and forbidden. But with that love came the weight of a kingdom's wrath. The news of their union traveled like wildfire. By the time they returned to England, the whispers had turned into a storm. Courtiers fell silent in their presence. Letters of outrage circled through the court. Even Brandon's friends urged him to prepare for execution. Imagine their arrival. The English court glittering with tapestries and jewels, but the air colder than stone. Henry V sat on his throne, his eyes fixed not on his sister, but on the man who had dared to steal her. The room held its breath. Everyone knew Henry's temper. He had executed men for less. One wrong word, one slip of the tongue, and Charles Brandon's head would roll. Mary clutched her husband's hand, though she knew it could not save him. They were about to face the fury of a king. This was no longer a love story. It was the beginning of a curse. The great hall of Westminster was silent. Courtiers stood pressed against the walls, their silks whispering as they shifted nervously. At the center of the chamber sat Henry Vi, broad, imposing, his eyes sharp as blades beneath his heavy crown. He had summoned his sister Mary and her new husband, Charles Brandon, to answer for their crime. A crime not of theft, nor treason, but of love. When Henry's gaze fell on Brandon, the air thickened. Charles was no stranger to danger. He had fought in tournaments, commanded armies, even been trusted as Henry's closest companion. But nothing had prepared him for this. This was not a friend's glare. This was a king's judgment, and the punishment could be death. Whispers swept through the court. Everyone knew Henry's temper. Only months before, noblemen had been executed for disobedience, their heads displayed on spikes above London Bridge. What mercy could Brandon hope for? He had defied the king, stolen his sister, and broken one of the crown's golden rules. No royal marriage without the monarch's consent. Mary, standing tall though her heart pounded, stepped forward. She was radiant still, her hair gleaming beneath her veil, her cheeks pale with fear. She did what few dared. She spoke directly to her brother. "Henry," she said, "I chose him. If you would see us punished, then punish me also, for I am guilty too." A murmur rippled across the hall. No woman, not even a princess, spoke to the king this way. Henry's jaw tightened. For a long, dangerous silence, he said nothing. Then, with a sudden fury, he rose from his throne. "You," he spat at Brandon, "should die for this." His words echoed off the stone walls, chilling everyone in the chamber. Brandon bowed his head, ready for the worst. He knew the scaffold well. He had watched men climb its steps and never return. Perhaps soon he would join them. But then came the twist that no one expected. Henry did not order the executioner. Instead, he offered something crueler: survival on his terms. Brandon would live, but he would pay dearly for his defiance. The king demanded a crushing fine, a ransom so vast that it would take years to repay. Every fortune Brandon possessed would now flow back into Henry's coffers. As for Mary, her humiliation would be public. Henry forced them to remarry, this time before the eyes of the English court. The secret chapel vows in France meant nothing. Now they would stand before nobles and clergy, repeating their promises under the king's watchful glare. Their love, once private and sacred, was turned into a spectacle of obedience. It was Henry's way of reminding everyone that no heart, not even a princess's, could defy him without consequence. Mercy in his hands was a weapon. He had spared them, but only to show the world that even forgiveness was his to command. And so Mary and Charles returned to their estates, married yet marked. Outwardly, they were wealthy, honored, and secure. But beneath the surface, they lived under a shadow. Every banquet invitation carried whispers of scandal. Every glance at court reminded them that their marriage was not a triumph of love, but a warning branded into history. Mary bore children, but the crown denied them the recognition of princes or princesses. They were noble? Yes, but never royal. The stain of Henry's punishment stretched beyond their own lives, seeping into the fate of their descendants. This was the brilliance of Henry's cruelty. He did not need the axe to destroy them. He simply clipped their wings, ensuring that their children and their children's children would never soar as high as their blood deserved. And yet, in silencing them, Henry sowed the seeds of a curse. The blood he sought to suppress would not vanish. It would seep into the veins of future generations, hidden but unbroken, waiting centuries to re-emerge. For Mary and Charles, the years that followed were bittersweet. They lived in fine houses, surrounded by wealth, yet their love was shadowed by the knowledge that it had cost them everything. Mary, once a queen of France and sister of England's king, was reduced to a duchess who had dared to love. Brandon, once the king's favorite, was forever watched with suspicion. And the children they raised, they would carry the mark of this defiance, a mark that would twist their fates into tragedy. The curse of the Tudors had begun to take shape. It would not strike at Henry, who lived and died in his splendor. It would strike at Mary's descendants, daughters whose names would be forgotten by many, yet whose bloodline would someday change history. As Mary Tudor looked at her children, she must have wondered, had she doomed them? Was her choice of love over power the act that cursed her family for centuries? The answer was already unfolding, though she could not yet see it. Her daughter Frances would one day give birth to Lady Jane Grey, the 9 days queen, a girl who wore a crown only to lose her head. The scaffold was waiting, and the blood that Henry thought he had silenced was only just beginning to cry out. Mary Tudor's gamble for love had spared her life, but its price rippled through the lives of her children. From the moment they were born, her daughters carried not only noble blood, but also the heavy weight of their mother's defiance. They were neither fully royal nor fully forgotten, suspended in a limbo crafted by Henry himself. To the world, they glittered in gowns of silk and jewels, but beneath the shimmer, they bore the invisible mark of their family's rebellion. The eldest, Frances Brandon, inherited her mother's fire. Proud, intelligent, and unyielding, she was raised in a household where every glance was watched, every letter read. Her parents taught her caution, but she grew up in the shadow of a crown she could never touch. When she came of age, her marriage was not hers to choose. It was arranged, carefully and strategically, to keep the Tudor bloodline contained. Her husband was Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, respectable, yes. Loyal to the crown, yes. But Frances quickly realized this was not a love story like her mother's. This was a cage lined with silk. Frances's daughters, however, would prove that no cage is ever strong enough to contain ambition and destiny. Jane, the eldest, was a quiet child with an appetite for books that astonished her tutors. While other girls played with silks and mirrors, Jane devoured the works of Plato and the scriptures of reform. She had the mind of a scholar, the heart of a Protestant, and the blood of Tudors. Dangerous ingredients in a kingdom tearing itself apart between Catholic and Protestant heirs. When King Edward VI, Henry's sickly son, rose to the throne, Jane's fate shifted. Edward was fragile, his breath shallow, his reign short-lived. He feared that his Catholic half, Sister Mary Tudor, known to history as Bloody Mary, would inherit the crown and undo his Protestant reforms. And so, Edward's advisors searched for an alternative heir, someone with royal blood but Protestant loyalty. Their eyes fell on Jane, 16 years old, brilliant, innocent, and completely unprepared for the storm to come. In the summer of 1553, Jane was thrust into the role of queen, not in grandeur, not with celebrations, but with trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks. She was led to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a monarch. The crown was placed upon her head, so heavy she could barely hold it. Chroniclers later said she wept openly, begging to return to her studies. But no one listened. For 9 days, England had a new queen. 9 fragile, uncertain days in which Jane carried the weight of a kingdom she had never wanted. In those days, the streets of London murmured with rumors. Some accepted her, others whispered treason. But across the countryside, A far greater force gathered the supporters of Mary Tudor, Henry VII's eldest daughter. Her claim was older, stronger, undeniable, and unlike Jane, she had no hesitation. Within 9 days, the tide turned. London shifted its loyalty to Mary, who marched triumphantly into the city, claiming the throne with fire in her eyes. Jane's reign crumbled like sand in the wind. The punishment was swift. Jane, her young husband, and her father were arrested. The world that had thrust a crown upon her head now abandoned her, even her own mother pleading for her own survival. Jane was left alone, alone in a cold tower cell, alone with the knowledge that her crown had lasted barely more than a week, and alone facing the inevitable judgment of her cousin, the Queen. On a February morning in 1554, Jane's young husband was led to the scaffold first. Jane watched from her window as his body, headless and broken, was carried back past her chamber. Hours later, she herself was summoned. 17 years old, calm, dignified, she mounted the scaffold. Blindfolded, she reached out for the block, fumbling. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she whispered in panic. A guard guided her hands, and then, in a single brutal stroke, the blade ended her short, tragic reign. The crowd fell silent. The granddaughter of Mary Tudor, the 9 days queen, was gone. A bloodline born of defiance had once again paid in blood. For many, Jane's execution was the end of the story. A final, tragic full stop. But for the Tudors, endings were never final. Jane had sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, and their lives, too, would carry the curse of this lineage. The axe had fallen, but the bloodline still lived. And fate, it seemed, was not finished with them. The shadow of Jane Grey's execution stretched long and dark over her younger sisters. Catherine and Mary Grey had grown up watching their cousin crowned and destroyed in less than 2 weeks, a lesson etched into their bones. Tudor blood was as much a death sentence as it was a privilege. They understood that every smile from the crown could become a noose, every promise of protection a lie. Yet, despite the warning carved into history by their sister's blood, both women would stumble into the same trap of royal ambition, sometimes by choice, sometimes by cruel design. Catherine Grey was the first to be tested. Fair-haired, delicate, and far less studious than Jane, she craved affection more than politics. Her heart was not built for the cold calculations of court. Yet her bloodline made her a figure of immense danger. Queen Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, now sat on the throne. Elizabeth was brilliant but paranoid, a queen without children, terrified that rivals would rise before her death and fracture her hard-won reign. Catherine, as Jane's sister and a Protestant with Tudor blood, was one of those rivals, whether she wanted to be or not. When Catherine secretly married Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, it might have been an act of youthful romance. But in the eyes of Elizabeth, it was an act of treason. A Grey daughter marrying into one of England's most powerful noble families meant the creation of a rival dynasty. The Queen could not allow it. When Catherine's pregnancy became impossible to hide, Elizabeth's fury burned hotter than fire. Catherine was thrown into the Tower of London, just like her sister before her. There she gave birth, in chains, to 2 sons. They should have been her joy, her triumph. Instead, they were treated as threats to the throne. The children were taken, the marriage declared invalid, and Catherine was left broken. Years later, she died still a prisoner, a faded ghost of the girl she once had been. If Catherine's curse was ambition mixed with love, her younger sister Mary Grey's fate was almost crueler. Small in stature, described cruelly by chroniclers as crook-backed and very little of stature, Mary had long been dismissed at court. People assumed her deformity spared her from the ambitions that destroyed her sisters. Who would plot to put such a woman on the throne? But the Tudor curse spared no one. Mary, like her sister, dared to love. She secretly married Thomas Keyes, the sergeant porter of the Queen's household, a man far beneath her in rank. Unlike Catherine, Her marriage was not politically dangerous. It was simply forbidden. Elizabeth, ever the watchful queen, could not tolerate such disobedience in her blood kin. Mary, too, was placed under house arrest, her marriage condemned, her freedom stolen. She lived the rest of her life in quiet sorrow, her body frail, her spirit worn thin by isolation. The Grey sisters became living symbols of the Tudor dynasty's cruelty, young women born with royal blood, condemned to die or waste away because of it. Jane lost her head. Catherine lost her freedom and children. Mary lost her love and her health. Three sisters bound by one fate, punished for being too close to a crown they never asked for. And yet, history's irony is cruel. Though all three sisters suffered, it was through them that the Tudor bloodline would quietly seep into the veins of future royalty. The Grey sisters, despite Elizabeth's fury, became ancestors of kings and queens. Their tragedy did not end with their deaths. It transformed into legacy. Elizabeth I, the great virgin queen, may have ruled with brilliance, but her refusal to wed or bear children meant her line would die with her. The throne would pass to other branches of the Tudor family tree, branches twisted and scarred by betrayal, blood, and exile. And in those branches, the descendants of the Grey sisters waited. This was the cruel paradox. Elizabeth fought her whole life to suppress them, but in the end, her legacy ensured their survival. From the ashes of Jane's execution, from Catherine's tears, from Mary's isolation, the bloodline endured. And in time, it would resurface in a figure the world adored, Diana, Princess of Wales. The Tudor curse had not ended. It had only gone underground, waiting for centuries to emerge again. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry Vi and Anne Boleyn, is remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs. To her subjects, she was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who defended the realm against the Spanish Armada and presided over a golden age of exploration and art. Yet behind the pageantry of her reign lay a queen haunted by blood, her own family's blood and that of her cousins who paid the price for their proximity to her throne. Elizabeth's shadow was long, cold, and merciless. Though she loved to be adored by her people, she could never truly trust anyone. Her own childhood had been shaped by betrayal. As a young girl, she watched her mother beheaded on her father's orders. She had lived under suspicion, imprisoned in the Tower herself, when her sister Mary, I suspected her of plotting treason. By the time Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she had learned one brutal lesson. In a family like the Tudors, even blood could not be trusted. That paranoia became policy. Elizabeth never married, a choice that baffled and angered many. To her, it was both a shield and a weapon. Marriage meant vulnerability, a husband who could usurp her power, a son who might rise against her before she was ready to let go. By remaining single, she projected strength and independence, but it also left one unavoidable problem: the succession. Who would rule after her? Every cousin, every relative with Tudor blood became a potential rival. And in Elizabeth's court, rivals rarely lived long. The Grey sisters knew this truth all too well. Jane was dead, Catherine imprisoned until her death, Mary broken in confinement. Elizabeth had destroyed them not because they rebelled, but because they might. That was enough. To Elizabeth, mercy was weakness. Better to suffocate a threat before it breathed. And yet, no matter how tightly she tried to control her family, new dangers emerged. The greatest of these came from Scotland. Her cousin, Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots. If Elizabeth was England's Protestant hope, Mary was the Catholic dream. To Catholics across Europe, Elizabeth was illegitimate, the bastard child of Henry Vieira's forbidden marriage to Anne Boleyn. Mary Stuart, on the other hand, was the true heir with unbroken royal blood. That claim alone made her dangerous. But it was Mary's charisma, her beauty, and her political alliances that made her deadly. Elizabeth kept her cousin under house arrest for nearly 20 years, moving her from one estate to another, always under watch but never free. To some, it seemed an act of restraint, the Virgin Queen showing mercy where others would not. But in truth, Elizabeth's delay was not kindness. It was calculation. She knew that killing a fellow queen would set a dangerous precedent. Yet Mary's existence was a thorn in her crown, inspiring endless plots to dethrone her. Eventually, Elizabeth made her choice. When evidence emerged tying Mary Stuart to an assassination plot, the Babington Plot, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. The axe fell not just on a cousin, but on the last hope of Catholic England. The crowd gasped when it took more than one blow to sever her head, her little dog found trembling beneath her skirts after the deed. It was brutal, theatrical, and symbolic. The Virgin Queen had slain her own blood to protect her reign. Elizabeth's decision haunted her. For days she locked herself in her chambers, claiming she had not truly wanted Mary's death. Yet the truth was clear: her dynasty could only survive through sacrifice. She ruled with brilliance, but her crown was balanced on a mountain of corpses, many of them kin. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind no husband, no children, no direct heir. The Tudor line, born of Henry VIII's ambition, ended with her. But the story did not end. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, the very bloodline Elizabeth had tried to extinguish. The irony was almost poetic. The Virgin Queen, who destroyed cousins to secure her throne, handed it at last to the child of the cousin she executed. And in this tangled web of blood and betrayal, one truth became clear. The Tudor curse was not just about executions or imprisonments. It was about the futility of power itself. No matter how fiercely Elizabeth fought to control the legacy, the blood found a way. The same bloodline she tried to suppress would continue to flow through history, winding its way through centuries until it surfaced in Diana, the people's princess. Elizabeth's reign shines in history as glorious, but its shadow was darker than most care to admit. The Virgin Queen built her throne on the bones of her family, proving once and for all that in the Tudors' world, survival demanded sacrifice, even of those you loved. When Elizabeth I breathed her last in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended not with rebellion or execution, but with silence. A queen without husband or child had closed her eyes, and with her, Henry V's proud line came to an end. But the crown cannot sit empty for long. It leapt across the border into Scotland, where a young king awaited James VI, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the very cousin Elizabeth had executed. The irony was sharp enough to cut steel. Elizabeth spent 2 decades keeping Mary under lock and key, fearing her claim to the throne, only to pass that same throne to Mary's son. The Tudors, with all their marriages, divorces, and beheadings, had failed to secure a future. The Stuarts, through patience and blood, inherited it instead. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a monarch, though not yet a government. But this inheritance was no smooth transition. It was soaked in betrayal and shadow. James was born into a storm of intrigue. His mother, Mary Stuart, had been forced to abdicate when he was just an infant. She fled to England seeking Elizabeth's protection, and instead found captivity. James grew up without her, raised as both a king and an orphan of politics. This inheritance carried both promise and curse. On paper, James was everything England needed: male, legitimate, a Protestant who could unite warring factions. In reality, he brought with him the ghosts of his mother's death. Many Catholics saw him as their hope, others as their betrayer. Protestants eyed him warily, remembering his mother's Catholic cause. From the moment he sat on the throne, James was trapped between factions, his crown a fragile prize balanced on the knife edge of faith. And then came the most infamous test of his reign, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and remembered most for Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up Parliament on the day of its opening, with James inside. The plan was simple and brutal: kill the king, his ministers, and much of the Protestant nobility in one fiery blast. Then replace him with his young daughter Elizabeth, who could be raised Catholic. It was treason in its most explosive form. But fate betrayed the conspirators. A single letter of warning revealed the scheme, and in the damp cellars beneath Westminster, guards found Fawkes crouched over barrels of gunpowder. The plot collapsed, and with it, James's trust in his Catholic subjects. Executions followed, grisly and public, a reminder that treason against the crown was a death sentence. The gunpowder plot became a symbol of the dangers that haunted the Stuart crown. Each November, the people lit bonfires to remember the day their king was saved, a tradition that echoes even now as fireworks and masks of Guy Fawkes. Yet behind the celebration was a truth James could not ignore: his inheritance was cursed. Like the Tudors before him, his rule would be defined by the fear of betrayal. Despite these trials, James saw himself as a bringer of peace. He ended England's long war with Spain, commissioned the King James Bible, and cultivated an image of authority blessed by God. Yet, the Tudor blood in his veins carried old shadows. His reign, though less bloody than Elizabeth's, was never free of conspiracy. His son, Charles I, would one day lose his head to the axe, proving the curse of crowns had not been lifted, only delayed. James's inheritance was more than a throne; it was a dynasty scared by blood. The Tudors left behind a legacy of suspicion, betrayal, and ambition, and the Stuarts inherited every thorn. They wore the crown, but at a cost. To be king was to be hunted, to trust no one, to sleep with one eye open. And as centuries passed, the Tudor bloodline wove itself deeper into the fabric of Britain's monarchy. Each generation inherited not just titles and lands, but the same curse, the same shadow that had once haunted Elizabeth and destroyed the Grey Sisters. It would stretch forward still, waiting to touch another life, another figure who would capture the world's heart before being broken by it. Princess Diana, centuries later, would inherit not the throne, but the same legacy of betrayal and tragedy. The names had changed, the palaces modernized, but the curse of ancestry remained. Her story was already written in blood long before she was born. The Tudor line may have ended with Elizabeth I, but the story of blood, betrayal, and inheritance did not. The Stuarts, who followed, carried the Tudor legacy forward, sometimes proudly, often painfully, and through them, a chain of ancestry was forged that would eventually bind itself to the modern Windsors. And to Diana herself, the Stuarts began their rule with James I, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. His reign brought relative peace, but the seeds of conflict had already been planted. His belief in the divine right of kings, that monarchs answered only to God, never to parliament or people, set him at odds with a changing world. When his son, Charles I, inherited the crown, those tensions exploded into civil war. The English Civil War was no ordinary rebellion. It was the people, through Parliament, rising against the king himself. The blood of Tudors and Stuarts had taught England about absolute rule, but now the nation demanded a new voice. Armies clashed, families split, and in 1649, history repeated itself: a monarch's head fell. Charles I was executed outside Whitehall, condemned not by foreign enemies, but by his own people. For the first time, the crown had failed to protect itself. Though the monarchy was later restored under Charles II and his brother James Siwa, the lesson lingered: crowns were fragile, bloodlines cursed with the burden of survival. Every Stuart monarch knew the same dread their Tudor kin had felt. Betrayal was never far, and power never secure. Even when William and Mary, then Queen Anne, ruled in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, succession was a constant battle. Anne, the last Stuart monarch, buried 17 children, leaving no heir to inherit her throne. The Tudor curse of barren lines and broken dynasties struck again. It was then that the crown passed to the House of Hanover. distant cousins with Stuart blood through James I's daughter. They were German in origin, yet English destiny pulled them into the same cursed circle. George I, George II, George III, one by one. Monarchs carried forward the Tudor shadow, struggling with wars abroad, revolutions across oceans, and family betrayals at home. George II, remembered as the Mad King, ruled through mental illness and rebellion, losing America in the process. His suffering was personal, but it echoed a familiar truth: the crown brought no peace, only trial. And yet, the blood continued. Through marriages and unions, the tangled web of Tudor and Stuart ancestry wound its way through the Hanoverians into the House of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, later renamed Windsor during the First World War. Each change of name disguised the same truth: the dynasty had changed its face, but its blood remained the same. By the 20th century, the monarchy wore a modern mask, but the curse was still there. Edward VI abdicated in scandal, choosing love over crown, a choice Henry VI might have understood all too well. George VI, Elizabeth Dly's father, never expected to rule, but was forced into duty by his brother's fall, a pattern echoing the Grey Sisters' tragedy centuries earlier. Even in a new age of democracy, the old ghosts clung to the palace walls. And then came Diana. When Lady Diana Spencer married Prince Charles in 1981, the world saw it as a fairy tale. The shy kindergarten teacher transformed into a princess, radiant in ivory silk, watched by millions across the globe. But beneath the glitter of tiaras and trumpets, history's curse stirred again. Diana's own lineage tied her not only to the Spencers, an old and noble family, but also to the Tudors and Stuarts through the Greys and their descendants. The blood of Mary Tudor, of Jane Grey, of Mary Stuart, of James I, all flowed through her veins. She carried the legacy of queens imprisoned, sisters executed, monarchs betrayed. Her destiny was not only written by the choices of her time, but by the centuries of shadows behind her. In Diana, the ancient story of the Tudors and Stuarts found its modern echo. A woman adored by the people, yet crushed by the weight of the crown. A figure of hope and tragedy, beauty and sorrow. Just as Elizabeth destroyed her cousins to preserve her throne, Diana too would be consumed, not by axe or tower, but by a relentless monarchy and an unforgiving press. The long shadow had finally reached the modern age. The same blood that had once crowned queens and condemned them now flowed in the woman the world would call the people's princess. And, as history had shown again and again, royal blood was never a blessing. It was a burden. To the world, Diana Frances Spencer was a modern fairy tale. Born into an aristocratic English family in 1961, she seemed ordinary compared to the centuries of kings and queens who had ruled before her. But Diana's blood was anything but ordinary. Beneath the shy smile and soft voice was a lineage that stretched back through centuries of intrigue, betrayal, and survival, straight to the Tudors and the cursed legacy they left behind. The Spencer family had long been woven into the fabric of English nobility. Their roots reached back to the 15th century, when the family rose as wealthy sheep farmers and landowners. By the 16th century, during the height of Tudor power, the Spencers had transformed into one of England's most respected aristocratic houses. They were not crowned monarchs, but they were close enough to feel the crown's heat, serving as courtiers, advisors, and allies to those who ruled. It was through marriages, however, that the Spencers tied themselves to something far greater: the Grey Sisters, descendants of Mary Tudor. Sister to Henry V, Jane Catherine, and Mary Grey had suffered terribly under the Tudor curse, but their bloodline endured through quieter, less conspicuous branches. While Elizabeth I died childless, and the Tudors seemed to vanish, the Greys lived on in noble houses like the Spencers. The crown had tried to suppress them, but their legacy persisted in silence. Diana's ancestry can be traced directly to Mary Tudor, Queen of France, Henry V's beloved younger sister. Mary married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and their union produced Frances Brandon, mother of Lady Jane Grey. Though Jane lost her life on the scaffold, her sisters Catherine and Mary passed down the bloodline that, over centuries, intertwined with the Spencers. By Diana's time, the connection was faint in names but strong in blood. This meant Diana was more than a distant aristocrat who married into the Windsors. She was, by birthright, a descendant of the Tudors themselves, a living link to the dynasty that had reshaped England with fire and steel. Her veins carried the same blood that had once flowed in Henry VI, Elizabeth I, and Mary Stuart. She was tied not just to the monarchy she married into, but to the monarchy that had, in many ways, destroyed itself. For Diana, this ancestry was no idle curiosity. It shaped the narrative of her life in ways she may never have realized. The people sensed something almost mythical in her, as though she embodied both the grace of queens past and the tragedy that stalked them. Like Jane Grey, she was young, innocent, and thrust into the glare of the crown. Like Catherine Grey, she was punished for loving outside the rigid rules of monarchy. Like Elizabeth I, she was adored by her people, but isolated within her own court. The irony is cruel when Diana walked down the aisle of Staines, Paul's cathedral, to marry Prince Charles. She was not just joining the royal family. She was returning to it. The Tudors had died out in name, but through Diana, they had re-entered the palace. She was unknowingly a child of the dynasty that had spilled so much blood to hold on to power. The Spencer-Tudor connection also meant that Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, carried this blood too. For the first time in centuries, the direct descendants of Mary Tudor sat once again at the heart of the British monarchy. Through William, future kings will inherit both the Windsor legacy and the Tudor curse, bound together in a lineage that stretches back to the throne's darkest days. This ancestry is more than family trees and dusty archives. It explains why Diana's story felt so hauntingly familiar to the public. Her fate echoed the same themes that had defined her ancestors: innocence turned into sacrifice, adoration shadowed by betrayal, love destroyed by the demands of power. The Tudors may have fallen, but their curse remained alive in Diana's life and death. And just as Elizabeth I's reign ended the Tudors without an heir, Diana's life ended too soon, leaving her legacy to her children. The parallels were chilling. History was not simply repeating. It was unfolding again, centuries later, in a woman whose every smile concealed the shadow of her ancestors. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, the world believed it was watching a fairy tale. The young schoolteacher became a princess in a gown spun like a dream, stepping into St. Paul's cathedral before millions of adoring eyes. But beneath the glitter, the shadow of history stretched long. What the public saw as a beginning was, in truth, an echo, the old Tudor curse awakening in a modern age. Like Lady Jane Grey centuries earlier, Diana was barely out of girlhood when she was thrust into the brutal machinery of monarchy. Jane had been crowned against her will, a pawn in the games of ambitious men. Diana, too, was caught in forces larger than herself. The marriage to Charles was not merely a love story, it was a dynastic alliance, carefully arranged to produce heirs and secure the future of the crown. Her role was written before she ever had a chance to define it. In Jane's time, the price of innocence was death. For Diana, the price was isolation. From the moment she entered Buckingham Palace, she discovered that her life no longer belonged to her. Every gesture, every word, every expression was scrutinized by press and palace alike. Like the Grey sisters, who were punished not for crimes, but for what they represented, Diana was judged for being herself, too emotional, too human, too unwilling to be silent. Her marriage, like Catherine Grey's, became a prison. Catherine's secret union with Edward Seymour led to her imprisonment and the separation from her children. Diana's marriage to Charles, though public and celebrated, was just as confining. Charles's long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles haunted Diana, turning her palace into a cage of betrayal. The parallels with her ancestors were unmistakable: royal women punished not for rebellion, but for needing love in a world that allowed them none. Even Elizabeth's shadow can be seen in Diana's life. Elizabeth remained unmarried to preserve her throne, sacrificing personal happiness for power. Diana, by contrast, married for the sake of the crown and lost her happiness to it. Where Elizabeth denied herself intimacy to secure her rule, Diana was denied true love because of her role. Both women were adored by the people, but lived alone in their own ways. The Virgin Queen in her court, Diana in her gilded cage. And then there is Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and rival, executed after years of confinement. Mary was glamorous, charming, beloved by some and loathed by others, her life devoured by intrigue and rumor. Diana's public image carried that same dangerous duality. She was adored by the masses, hounded by the press, and trapped by her own vulnerability. In both women, the people saw not just royalty, but humanity, and for that, both paid a terrible price. Diana's fate was not sealed with the stroke of an axe or the signing of a death warrant, but with the relentless pursuit of flashing cameras and tabloid headlines. On August 31, 1997, in a Paris tunnel, she met the end that history seemed to have scripted for her: sudden, violent, and devastating. Like Jane on the scaffold, like Mary Stuart at Fotheringhay, Diana's death was more than personal tragedy. It was spectacle, witnessed by the world, seared into collective memory. The Tudor curse had found its modern echo. In Diana, the centuries of sorrow carried by the Greys, the Tudors, and the Stuarts lived again, a young woman burdened by lineage, destroyed not by her own failings, but by the merciless weight of monarchy. The cycle had not been broken, it had simply adapted, reshaping itself for a new age. And yet, Diana's story carried something her ancestors did not hope. For while Jane's bloodline was suppressed, while Catherine and Mary Grey were erased into obscurity, Diana's legacy endured in her children. Princes William and Harry inherited her humanity, her compassion, and her Tudor blood. In them, the curse was not just shadow but possibility, a chance to transform the story from tragedy into something greater. The echoes of history are undeniable. The question now is whether the cycle will repeat again, or whether Diana's sacrifice might finally break the curse that had haunted her family for 5 centuries. The story of Princess Diana does not end in the Paris tunnel. Like the Tudors and the Greys before her, her personal tragedy became part of a larger story, one written in bloodlines and destiny. The Tudor curse had followed her into the 20th century, but in her children, Princes William and Harry, it took on a new shape. For the first time in centuries, the descendants of Mary Tudor, Lady Jane Grey, and the Stuart line now stood once more at the heart of Britain's monarchy. William Arthur Philip Lewis, born in 1982, and Henry Charles Albert David, Harry, born in 1984, were not only heirs to the Windsor dynasty. Through their mother, they carried the blood of the Tudors and Stuarts, the same veins that once ran with queens imprisoned and cousins executed. Their faces may have smiled on magazine covers, but their heritage whispered of scaffold and shadow. It is a reminder that the crown is not just an inheritance of jewels and palaces, but of ghosts. William, destined to be king, embodies both sides of his lineage. On his father's side, he is Windsor, heir to the throne of Elizabeth II, bound by centuries of duty. On his mother's, he is Spencer, Grey Tudor, carrying the blood of women who were silenced, forgotten, or destroyed by the crown. This duality gives his role a symbolic weight. When he takes the throne, he will not only inherit the Windsor legacy, but also redeem, in a sense, the sacrifices of Jane Grey, Catherine Grey, and Mary Stuart. He is the living bridge between monarchy's triumphs and its tragedies. Harry, meanwhile, has carried the curse in another form. Unlike William, who bears the burden of kingship, Harry has often found himself cast in the role of the rebellious prince, echoing those Tudor cousins who lived in the shadow of the throne, forever judged and constrained by proximity to it. His struggles with the institution, his decision to step away with his wife Meghan, and his public clashes with the monarchy mirror the centuries-old pattern those too close to the crown are never truly free. The Tudor curse still echoes in his life, not in executions or prisons, but in exile and estrangement. Through Diana's sons, history itself seems to breathe again. Their lives play out under the same scrutiny, the same tension between duty and love, that haunted their mother and her ancestors. Every headline, every photograph, every whisper of scandal is another reminder that monarchy, even in a modern democracy, is still theater, and its players still bleed when the curtain falls. But perhaps the greatest difference is this: Diana's legacy has given her sons something their Tudor ancestors never had: humanity in the eyes of the people. Where Jane Grey was forgotten by all but historians, Diana is remembered daily by millions. Her compassion, her willingness to embrace those shunned by society, her refusal to be merely ornamental, all of these left an indelible mark not just on her sons, but on the very image of monarchy. Through William and Harry, her spirit endures, reshaping how royals are seen and how they must live. The Tudor curse is real, but curses can evolve. In Diana's ancestors, it meant imprisonment, execution, and extinction. In Diana herself, it meant isolation, betrayal, and an early death. But in William and Harry, it may yet transform into resilience, the ability to carry the burden of history while refusing to be destroyed by it. Their choices, their futures, will decide whether the curse continues or whether it is finally broken. In the end, Diana's life connected the present to the past with a thread of blood that cannot be severed. From Mary Tudor, the gilded princess trapped by her brother's ambition, to Jane Grey, the nine-day queen sacrificed to politics, to Mary Stuart, the rival executed by her cousin, to Elizabeth I, who ruled alone and left no heir, all their stories live again in the arc of Diana's own. And now, in her sons, the cycle waits for its next chapter. Perhaps the blood of the Tudors will always carry sorrow. Or perhaps, at last, it has found its redemption in the very hairs who bear Diana's smile.